Fermentation temperatures. And this is my own carboy. The fermentation temperature got way too high. The beer went nuts. It clogged the airlock and made a hell of a mess, as you can see. And like an idiot, I didn't use a blow-off tube. But really, in my experience judging competitions, tasting a lot of other people's homebrews at events and homebrew club meetings, and even looking back on my early days in homebrewing and the mistakes that I made, really most of the faults come down to an issue with fermentation temperatures. And in most cases, these temperatures getting way too high and producing all sorts of nasty off flavors. So if there's one single thing you can do to improve your beer the most, I always say it's controlling your fermentation temperatures. And I'm going to give you the 3-step process to do that. Okay, so what off flavors are we talking about? Well, like I said, most off flavors, right? So this is one of those things that you can do that gets rid of just a ton of unwanted flaws, nasty flavors in your beer. So we're talking about excessive esters. Every beer has esters in it, and certain beers have more esters than others. German wheat beers, for example, have a lot of great bubblegum and banana esters. British beers have esters, but it's a fault if there's too many of them. And when the temperature gets too high, they get really fruity and just kind of nasty tasting. And the same thing with phenols. You don't want to have excessive phenols in your beer. They can be peppery and often really medicinal. And when the temperature gets out of control, that's what happens. Diacetyl is another one that's going to be solved by this process, this 3-step method I'm going to show you. And that's the buttery or butterscotch or movie theater popcorn like flavor in your beer. Solvent tea, we're going to take care of that too. Same thing with that alcoholic flavor. And also acetaldehyde, which is that green apple flavor. So really, if you just get a handle on this technique, you can wipe out a lot of off flavors. And most importantly, this really just gives you a cleaner tasting beer. Often when you taste a beer that you don't really know exactly what's wrong with it, you just can't put your finger on it, usually it comes down to an issue with fermentation. Okay, so before I go into the 3 steps here, let me just say that there are certain beers that this works best for. This really works best for American ales and English ales. So your IPAs, pale ales, amber ales, stouts, porters, brown ales, ESB, extra special bitter. And those are really the beer styles that most homebrewers are making these days. So this will be really relevant. Now you could use this for other types of beer like lagers and Belgians and German beers, but often those require something a little more specialized in terms of the fermentation temperatures. So you could use this, but this is really intended more for those English and American ales. Okay, step 1 is pitch low and let rise. What this means is adding the yeast at a lower temperature than usual and letting it rise just a couple degrees. So let's look at a graph here. So let's say that this homebrewer normally chills their beer to 70 degrees and doesn't have any temperature control and just lets it kind of sit there. I'm saying instead chill it down to 66 degrees on the cooler side and then let it warm up a couple of degrees to the fermentation temp, which is 68. So what pitching low does, it gives you a good buffer. If you don't have good temperature control, if you don't have a chest freezer and a thermostat, and you're chilling to a warmer temperature, like say low to mid 70s, you're putting yourself in the danger zone there because that beer is going to heat up on its own anyways, and you really don't want it getting up into the mid or high 70s. And that's when those off flavors get produced. So by pitching it lower, you give yourself a buffer zone there, and you're also waking up the yeast a little bit with that free rise. So the yeast gets more active the warmer the temperature gets. So if you add them at 66 and let them warm up just a little bit to 68, that really gets their engines running. So that's step 1, pitch low and let rise over the course of a day or so. So this is a good example for those ales that we talked about, IPAs, stouts, porters, etc. Pitch at 66 and let rise to 68. Step 2 then is holding that temperature steady during fermentation. Now hopefully you have some sort of temperature control where you can do this, but step 2 is holding it at that temperature 68, which I found is a really great fermentation temperature. You could even go a little bit cooler than that. You could even pitch at 64, let it rise to 66 and hold it. I've done that plenty of times as well. But 68 works just fine too. And you want to hold that during the bulk of fermentation. I would say 90% of fermentation, which in this example, and of course it's going to vary, but in this example, it's about a week. Step 3 then, the final step, is to raise the temperature at the end of fermentation. So those first 2 steps are going to eliminate a lot of the off flavors. So those solventy flavors and alcoholic flavors and those excessive fruity esters and the phenols that are going to be produced. Those occur when you get up into the low, mid, high 70s and even into the 80s. Some brewers let them get up there. But then at the end of fermentation, we want the beer to get cleaned up of any off flavors that were produced. And we do that by letting the temperature rise just a couple more degrees. So in this case, it's going from 68 to 70. And that's going to clean up the diacetyl. And the diacetyl is that buttery flavor that we talked about earlier. And the reason we can let it rise a little bit here and not worry about off flavors being produced is because most of the flavors, almost all the flavors from fermentation, are made in the first 72 hours. So since we're outside that range, we don't have to worry so much about the beer warming up and producing more off flavors. Actually, at the end here, we're going to get the yeast more mobilized and they're going to come back around and clean up any of those unwanted flavors that were produced earlier on. The main one being diacetyl, that buttery flavor. That chemical can really stick around at the end of fermentation, so you want to eliminate that at the end, and this little rise at the end here to 70, and you can even go up to 72 if you want. That little rise is going to clean that right up. Okay, so that's it. That's my 3-step method for eliminating most of the off flavors found in homebrew. If your homebrews just really haven't been up to snuff and you couldn't put your finger on why, and they just haven't been too clean tasting, too polished tasting, then I recommend you give this technique a shot, and I promise you it will turn your beer right around. And let me know how it goes. Thanks guys. Cheers.